After his wife's death, a man inherited an old cabin high in the mountains. He thought he was just going there to clear his mind, but what he found inside made him cry. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The kettle whistled too long before Andrew Lawson noticed. He reached for it out of habit, not thirst, and poured water into a cup already stained from too many unwashed mornings. Steam rose, then faded into the dim winter air of the small coastal kitchen. The light outside was the color of pewter, the kind that flattened everything, the yard, the ocean beyond it, the empty chair across from him where she used to sit. Her mug was still there, a crack running through the handle, rim chipped where she always tapped her spoon twice before stirring. 3 months had passed since she died, yet her presence lingered like the scent of her shampoo in the hallway, like warmth that refused to leave a cool bed. He sat at the table, staring at the envelope he'd already opened, but hadn't dared to read again. The lawyer had called yesterday. Something about an estate transfer. He'd gone to the office because it was easier than saying no. They'd sat in a sterile room that smelled faintly of lemon polish, papers spread out before him, the lawyer explaining in that careful tone people used around grief. "Your late wife owned property," the man had said, "a cabin in Ravalli County, Montana." Andrew had blinked, thinking it was a mistake. Macy hated secrets. She hated surprises even more. The lawyer had slid the documents across the table title papers. Tax receipts, a small metal key attached to a tag that read, West Hollow Road, mile 42. Alongside it was a letter, Macy's handwriting unmistakable. She'd written it in the last months, shaky but precise. "Go there in winter. You'll understand." He hadn't understood anything since the morning she left their bed for the hospital and never came back. He remembered the rhythm of the oxygen machine, her voice thinner each day, and the way she'd asked him once, almost apologetically, "Promise me you'll keep breathing after I stop?" He had promised, and now he was failing. Rain started again, tapping the windows with uneven fingers. He folded the letter back into its envelope and set it on the table, next to the untouched tea. The kitchen clock ticked, a dry, patient sound. He glanced around at the house they had built together, unfinished shelves he'd never sanded, photographs on the wall where her smile made the rest of the frame seem unnecessary. There was no space here that didn't echo her. He rose slowly, joints stiff from nights on the couch. Her jacket still hung by the door, red flannel faded to soft pink at the cuffs. He lifted it once, thinking of how small she'd seem near the end. The air in the house felt wrong without her laughter. Too still, too careful, like a museum display of a life no longer in use. The phone buzzed with a message from the mechanic oil change reminder, something she'd set to repeat years ago. He deleted it, then froze at the next notification. Reminder, call Dr. Jensen. Another leftover of her meticulous routines. She'd always taken care of things. Of him. Even dying, she had thought ahead. He could almost hear her voice. "You'd forget your own name if I didn't write it down for you." He sat again, this time opening the envelope fully, flattening the letter on the table. The ink had bled slightly near the fold. She must have written it by hand, unwilling to type something so final. "If you're reading this, love, it means I couldn't tell you myself. The cabin is ours, though you didn't know it. I bought it last year. Don't be angry. It isn't a secret in the way you think. Go there when the snow comes. Go in winter. You'll understand why." He stared at those last 3 words until they blurred. Go in winter. Why winter? Macy had always loved that season, the hush, the stillness. But she'd grown up in Oregon rain, not Montana snow. Maybe it was sentimental, a poetic flourish in her farewell. Or maybe, as the lawyer suggested, she wanted him to find something. He tried to picture what that could be, letters, journals, some final gift. Or maybe nothing at all. Maybe it was just her way of making sure he didn't drown here among the ghosts of routine. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in the living room with the lights off, watching headlights sweep across the distant highway through the rain. At 2 a.m. he rose, went to the garage and pulled a duffel bag from a shelf. Inside were the remnants of their hiking days, an old compass, a folding knife, a rusted camp stove. He hadn't used them in years. He added gloves, a wool hat, her scarf that still smelled faintly of her. He told himself he was only packing to be ready, that he might not actually go. But before dawn, when the rain softened into a silver mist, he found himself staring at the truck in the driveway, engine shivering to life. He drove first to the grocery store. The clerk, a kid barely out of high school, smiled politely, scanning his coffee, canned soup, bottled water. "Road trip?" he asked. Andrew hesitated, then said, "Something like that." The kid nodded without caring. Outside, the wind carried the salt of the sea. The horizon looked washed out, the color of bone. Back home, he spread the map across the kitchen counter. Ravalli County, he traced the line with his finger. Bitterroot Mountains, endless white ridges he remembered only vaguely from pictures. It would be at least 12 hours of driving, maybe more in snow. He could delay, wait until spring. But the words on the letter echoed again. Go there in winter. He moved through the house one last time. In their bedroom, he paused at her nightstand. Her reading glasses lay folded on top of a half-finished book. He picked it up, essays on breathing, mindfulness, the kind of quiet wisdom she'd always loved. The bookmark was a torn bus ticket from their trip to Seattle years ago. He left it in place and closed the book. On the wall above the bed hung a photograph of them in Yellowstone, both laughing, her hair whipped by the wind, his hand at her waist. He took it down carefully, slipped it into the side pocket of his duffel. By noon, the sky had cleared into a pale gray. The house smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. He locked the door, stood for a moment on the porch, and looked back through the window. Inside, everything seemed smaller, tidier, like a stage set after the play has ended. He adjusted his collar, tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket, and walked to the truck. The seatbelt clicked. The key turned. The engine coughed, then steadied. For a moment he hesitated, hands on the wheel, eyes on the rearview mirror. The driveway curved down toward the highway, and beyond that, the unknown. He thought of her voice, the calm certainty with which she'd always said his name, and whispered it to himself as if invoking strength. All right, Mace, I'm going. The truck rolled forward. Rain began again, soft, steady, cleansing. Behind him, the small house blurred into mist. Ahead, somewhere past the mountains and the snow, waited a cabin he'd never seen, and perhaps an answer he wasn't sure he wanted. The first miles felt heavy, each turn of the tires pulling him farther from the life they'd shared. But as the coastline faded in the rearview mirror, something loosened inside him. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet. More like the faint memory of it, a breath he'd forgotten how to take. He turned on the radio searching for her favorite station, but all he found was static. He left it that way, a low white noise filling the silence as the road carried him east. He didn't look back again. The letter rested on the passenger seat, creased and worn, the handwriting visible through the paper. Go there in winter, it said, and so he drove toward the winter, toward whatever waited beyond the snow. The rain turned to sleet somewhere near Spokane. By the time Andrew crossed into Idaho, the sky had hardened into white, a dull and endless ceiling pressing low over the earth. The truck heater hummed, barely keeping pace with the cold that leaked through the doors. The wipers clicked rhythmically, carving momentary clarity into the windshield before the next wave of snow swallowed it again. He'd been driving for hours, long enough for the ocean smell to fade from his clothes, and for silence to replace the constant background of waves he'd lived with all his life. Now the silence had weight. It pressed against the cab like a hand, urging him to think, to remember. He tried not to. The road demanded his attention anyway. Slick curves, invisible lanes, warning signs half buried in snow. By late afternoon, he pulled into a roadside diner, its neon sign buzzing dimly in the storm. Inside, it smelled of coffee and fried potatoes. A few truckers huddled near the window, their voices low, worn from the road. The waitress, gray-haired and friendly, poured him a cup without asking. You look like you've been driving through ghosts, she said. Something like that, he replied. His voice sounded strange to him, rough, unused. He ate slowly, staring at the map spread across the counter. Ravalli County was still hours away. The road he needed, West Hollow, looked thin and uncertain, a narrow line curling deep into the mountains. He folded the map carefully, left cash under the cup, and walked back into the storm. The next few hours blurred into monotony. The world outside the headlights didn't exist. There was only the immediate stretch of road, the rising snowbanks, the occasional flash of animal eyes. At one point he pulled over, turned off the engine, and just listened. The silence was immense, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. For the first time since she died, he felt something close to calm. Not peace, not yet, but a pause in the noise of grief. When fatigue finally forced him off the highway, he found a motel near Missoula. The sign flickered, half the letters out. Inside, the carpet was damp with melted snow, and the radiator clanked like old bones. He hung his jacket by the door, rubbed his hands, and sat on the edge of the bed. The letter from Macy was in his pocket. He unfolded it again, tracing her handwriting with his thumb. The ink had faded to a soft gray. "Go there in winter. You'll understand." The heater rattled as he stared at those words. What was there to understand? She'd been gone for 3 months. There was no mystery that could undo that fact. Yet the letter felt alive, like a voice that refused to fade. He fell asleep with it in his hand, the storm whispering against the window. By morning, the world was transformed. The motel parking lot was a white field, cars half buried, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. He brushed snow from the windshield, fitted the tire chains the old man at the gas station had sold him, and drove north toward the Bitterroot Valley. The mountains rose like walls, their peaks lost in low cloud. It was beautiful and merciless, the kind of landscape that erased everything small and human. Around noon, he stopped at a general store that seemed to belong to another century. A hand-painted sign swung above the door, creaking. Inside, shelves were lined with canned food, kerosene lamps, and boxes of nails. The man behind the counter looked to be in his 70s, wrapped in flannel, a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. "Heading up that road?" the man asked, nodding toward the snow-covered path outside. "West Hollow," Andrew said. "Mile 42. The old man raised an eyebrow. "Ain't much up there this time of year. Nobody lives past mile 30. "I'm not staying long," Andrew said, though even as he said it, the words felt uncertain. The man took a drag of his cigarette. "Snow gets bad up there. Sometimes drifts cover the road. You got a winch?" Andrew shook his head. The old man exhaled slowly, smoke curling through the cold air. "You'll want one. Folks don't always come back quick if they get stuck." He disappeared behind the counter and returned with a heavy coil of rope. "Take it. On the house, just in case." Andrew hesitated, then took it. "Thanks." "Keep your lights on, even in daylight," the man added. "The mountains play tricks in winter. They swallow the light." Back in the truck, the words lingered. The road narrowed as he climbed higher. Pines crowded close, their branches heavy with snow, and the sky dimmed from gray to slate. The asphalt turned to packed ice, then to dirt hidden beneath frost. The truck lurched and slid, tires whining. Twice he had to stop, clear branches, adjust the chains. The first sign of the cabin came at dusk, a mailbox leaning at an angle, the name Lawson scrawled faintly in fading paint. He slowed, turning onto the side road barely visible beneath the snow. The path wound through the forest, silent except for the crunch of tires. When he finally saw the roofline, half buried under white, a strange relief washed over him. The cabin was real. It wasn't a metaphor, not a symbol of grief. It stood there, solid, simple, waiting. He parked, engine idling, and stepped out. The cold was immediate, biting through his coat. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, though no smoke rose from the chimney. The key fit the lock easily. When the door swung open, warmth met him. Not heat, but a memory of it. The air was dry, faintly scented with cedar. Dust had settled evenly, yet the room didn't feel abandoned. Inside was order. A small wood stove in the corner, stacked firewood, a table set neatly with 2 mugs, and along the far wall, shelves filled with labeled jars, tea, sugar, flour. She had been here, recently, maybe even in her final months. He ran his hand over the table's surface. It was clean, polished, no cobwebs in the corners. He lit a fire, watching the flames catch and build. The sound of crackling wood filled the silence, softer than rain, steadier. His eyes wandered, absorbing details. A plaid blanket draped over the couch, a pair of snow boots by the door, a framed picture on the mantel. He moved closer, and the air caught in his throat. It was them. The photo showed him and Macy on a mountaintop, both younger, both laughing. He didn't remember this exact picture being taken. The background matched the ranges outside, the same folds of white and blue. On the back, in her handwriting, were 4 words. "You had to see this." He stared at the photograph for a long time, feeling the thin distance between then and now collapse into something unbearably close. She had been here. She had stood in this room, arranged these shelves, written those words. Maybe even while he'd been downstairs fetching medicine or pretending not to notice how quickly she was fading. The fire settled into a steady rhythm. He sat by it, the photo in his lap, and let the warmth reach him slowly. The storm outside thickened, sealing the cabin in snow. For the first time since she died, the silence didn't feel hostile. It felt chosen. When he finally looked up, he noticed a small envelope on the shelf near the window. His name was written across it in her hand. Below, in smaller letters, she'd written, "Open after you light the fire." He held it carefully, almost afraid to break the seal. The paper was cold, but the ink had faded in places as if touched by warmth once. He turned it over in his hands, heart unsteady, then slipped his finger under the flap and began to open it as the wind howled against the glass, and the fire threw long, flickering shadows across the room. The envelope was light, almost empty, as though it might contain nothing at all. Andrew sat by the fire, his hands trembling, the orange glow painting his fingers in uneven light. He slid a folded sheet from inside. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and something else, perhaps her perfume, faint but unmistakable, a scent that belonged to their home years ago. The handwriting was hers, smaller and weaker than he remembered, but still steady enough to recognize. The first line simply said, "For you when the fire is warm enough." He read slowly, the words echoing in the silence. She wrote that the cabin had been her secret, a place she had come to alone after her diagnosis, when she needed space to think without frightening him. It wasn't a betrayal, she explained, but a gift, something she wanted him to have when she couldn't guide him anymore. The letter went on for pages, describing her days here, the early mornings when the snow was so blue it hurt to look at, the way the trees cracked in the cold like gunfire, and how she found peace in the sound of her own breath. As he read, his throat tightened. She had written as though she were still talking to him, recounting small details. How she had learned to chop wood with rhythm instead of strength. How the cabin's roof leaked on one side. How the stove burned too hot unless you stacked the logs sideways. He could almost hear her voice. She ended the letter by telling him that everything he needed was already there. Food, warmth, her words. "You'll find the rest when you're ready. Until then, breathe." The last word broke him. He folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and set it on the mantel beside the photograph. He sat for a long time, listening to the fire settle into a soft, steady hiss. Snow tapped the window panes, and outside the forest exhaled in gusts of wind. It was a soundless kind of company, one that seemed to understand. Later, when he explored the cabin further, he found a wooden box beneath the small writing desk. The lid creaked, revealing neat stacks of notebooks tied with twine. Each was labeled in her handwriting, Winter Notes, Year 1, Winter Notes, Year 2, and so on. The last one, half full, had no year written on it, only his name. He took that one to the table, poured himself a cup of the tea she'd left, and began to read. The first entries were practical. How to manage the chimney draft. Where to find the trail that led to a nearby spring. How to keep the pipes from freezing. Then came the more intimate pages, observations about life, her fears, her small triumphs. She wrote about losing her hair and how she refused to let it define her, how she would hum to herself while splitting kindling because the sound kept her grounded. There were notes about him too, written in the present tense, as if she were watching him from afar. "He will hate this silence at first," she wrote, "but if he stays long enough, he'll hear what's beneath it." He turned page after page, tears blurring the ink. Her voice filled the room more vividly than any photograph could. Then between 2 pages, a smaller note slipped loose. An ultrasound image folded around a short letter. The sight of it froze him. For a moment he thought he'd misread it. that it wasn't hers, but it was. Her handwriting again, smaller this time, uneven but unmistakable. There was another heartbeat once, she had written. I wanted to tell you, but the joy was too brief, and I couldn't bear to watch it become another sorrow for you to carry. I hope you can forgive me. This cabin was meant for all three of us, in a way. When I realized it would only be for you, I kept building it anyway. You needed a place that could hold everything I couldn't say. He stared at the image, the shadowy blur that had once been a promise, and felt something in him collapse quietly, not from anger but from the sheer tenderness of her attempt to protect him. He pressed the paper to his chest, his breath catching on the edge of a sob. She had carried that secret alone, and yet somehow it felt like he'd always known. The emptiness between them after her diagnosis had been full of something she was trying to hold back. Now he understood. The fire burned low as he turned back to the last pages of the notebook. She wrote of peace, of wanting him to live freely when she was gone. If you are here now, she wrote, then I was right. You always needed work more than words. Chop wood, fix the roof, walk the trail, warm the kettle. These small things are love in another form. Do them, and you'll find me there. He closed the notebook and sat staring into the embers. Outside, the wind moaned softly through the trees, carrying the weight of 1,000 miles of snow. He realized then that she hadn't left him instructions to remember her. She'd left him a way to live. When he rose to stretch, something caught his eye near the far wall, a large trunk secured with a leather strap. On the lid, scrawled faintly in chalk, were 2 words, for him. He hesitated before unbuckling the strap. Inside lay a folded blanket, a stack of envelopes, and beneath them, an old metal flash drive taped to the bottom of the box. He didn't touch it. Not yet. A message that had waited this long could wait a little longer. Instead, he lifted the blanket and draped it over his shoulders. It smelled faintly of soap and pine, a scent that made his chest ache. He placed the notebook beside the others, then walked to the door and opened it. The cold hit him instantly, sharp and clean. The forest stretched in every direction, silent and endless, the snow glowing faintly in the moonlight. For the first time, he stepped outside without dread. The crunch beneath his boots felt grounding. The air stung his face, but it carried her memory in every breath. He walked a little way down the path she had written about, the one toward the spring. The moon hung low, and the trees swayed gently, their branches whispering in the dark. He imagined her walking there years ago, bundled in that same blanket, writing notes by lantern light, believing that one day he'd come. When he returned to the cabin, his cheeks were raw, but his heart was steady. He sat again by the fire, reopened the last page of her letter, and read the final line aloud. This place isn't about loss, love. It's about breath. Take one for me now. He did. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the cold, dry air, and when he exhaled, it no longer hurt as much as it used to. He looked once more at the sealed envelopes and the flash drive, knowing they would wait for him. For tonight, it was enough to sit in her chair, wrapped in her blanket, surrounded by the quiet she had left behind. The snow fell steadily outside, burying the old tracks in the road, erasing everything except the sound of the fire and the steady rhythm of his breathing. The snow had not stopped for 2 days. It drifted endlessly past the windows, a quiet curtain that blurred the forest into pale abstraction. Andrew woke each morning to the same sound, the soft groan of wind pressing against the roof, the whisper of snow sliding off the eaves. He no longer felt the oppressive silence that had terrified him on the first night. The quiet had taken on a rhythm, a kind of slow heartbeat that matched his own. Every morning he would stoke the fire, sweep the snow from the porch, and open the notebook to reread her handwriting. These small acts had become his way of speaking back to her, of answering without words. When the storm eased that afternoon, he decided to follow the note she had left about the spring. He strapped on the old snowshoes he'd found behind the stove and stepped outside, the air biting his face sharp as glass. The forest around him glittered beneath a sun that barely rose above the ridge. The path curved gently downward, and though it was half buried, he could make out faint impressions where she must have once walked, the ghost of a trail etched into the snow. Each step was an effort, yet it steadied him. He could hear his breath, see it rise in pale clouds before fading into the air. After half an hour, he reached the place she had described, a small clearing where a cluster of pines formed a natural arch. Beneath one of them stood a massive spruce, its trunk scarred with time. At its base, the snow had melted slightly, revealing a patch of frozen earth. He brushed it clean with his gloves and saw the mark she'd written about a tiny carved snowflake, the size of a coin. He ran his fingers over it, feeling the grooves. She had done this for him, not as a clue, not as a riddle, but as an anchor. The sunlight filtered weakly through the branches, glinting on the frost. He stood there a long time, until his fingers began to ache from the cold. Back at the cabin, the roof had begun to creak under the new snow. Remembering one of her notes, he climbed the ladder and cleared it carefully, scraping ice from the edges and tightening a loose metal strip near the chimney. He imagined her doing the same, hands steady even as her body failed her. When he came down, he laughed quietly to himself, realizing that he had started to talk to her aloud while he worked at small comments, complaints, even jokes. "You didn't mention how heavy this snow gets," he muttered, shaking his head. The sound of his own voice no longer startled him. Inside, the fire had burned low, but he knew how to manage it now. He stacked the logs crosswise just as she had written, and watched the flames catch quickly, throwing light across the room. He heated soup from one of the jars she had left, thick with lentils and vegetables. It tasted exactly like the kind she used to make when they were young, when everything in their lives had felt permanent. He ate slowly, staring at the window where the snow pressed close against the glass, soft and unthreatening. That night he opened one of the sealed envelopes from the trunk. Inside was another letter, written in the same steady script. "You're doing well," she began. "If you've found this, it means you've already learned how to tend the fire without me telling you how. I hope you're proud of yourself. It's not a skill for survival. It's a skill for staying human." Her words went on to describe the things she had loved about winter, the taste of metal in the air, the glow of lanterns, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. She ended with a small reminder. Don't try to outrun the silence. Listen to it instead. It will tell you when you're ready to speak again. He read that line several times. Ready to speak again. He hadn't truly spoken to anyone in weeks, not since leaving Oregon. There was a town 15 miles away he knew, but the idea of company still felt foreign. The only conversation he wanted was with her memory, and somehow, here, that seemed enough. When the storm returned that evening, he found himself thinking less about loss and more about the mechanics of staying warm. The chimney smoked when the wind shifted, and he remembered her note about adjusting the damper to 1/3. He crouched beside the stove, following her instructions precisely. The smoke thinned and the fire steadied. For a moment he felt almost proud, as if she were watching from across the room, nodding with approval. Later, as he sat near the hearth, the wind howled through the trees like a low symphony. He took the notebook and began writing, not to replace hers, but to continue it. He described the clearing, the carved snowflake, the repairs to the roof. His handwriting was awkward, unused, but it felt right to fill the empty pages. He even recorded what he'd eaten, the temperature, the way the air smelled before the snow returned. These simple details anchored him to the present, to living. Near midnight, when he finally set the pen down, he noticed something he hadn't before. A small cardboard box sitting just inside the front door. He was certain it hadn't been there earlier. The edges were damp, the label nearly obscured by frost. He brought it inside and wiped away the snow. A courier sticker bore a date, 1 day after Macy's death. His breath caught. He opened it carefully. Inside was a folded wool blanket, soft and thick, the color of smoke. Beneath it were two familiar objects, her mug, the one with the chipped rim, and a small thermos. Taped to the side was a flash drive in a clear plastic case. Written on the tape in her handwriting were 2 words, "My last." He sat very still, the items spread across the table. The fire popped behind him, casting light over the mug and thermos as though they were relics. He could imagine her organizing this, making sure it would arrive even after she was gone, planning it with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. The thought both broke and comforted him. He didn't reach for the flash drive, not yet. The idea of hearing her voice, or seeing her, felt both unbearable and necessary. But he wasn't ready. Instead, he took the blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders, then placed her mug beside his own on the table. Two cups, side by side, their shadows overlapping in the glow of the firelight. Outside, the wind began to die down. Snow still fell, but softly now like ash from a distant fire. He stared into the flames until his eyes burned, then whispered into the quiet. "You kept your promise, Mace. You made sure I wouldn't freeze." It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud in weeks. The sound filled the room and lingered, gentle, steady. By the time he finally looked toward the flash drive again, the storm had ended. The night beyond the window was still, moonlight spilling across the drifts. He reached over, took the drive in his hand, and turned it between his fingers. The label gleamed faintly in the light. He felt no rush now, no fear, only a sense of gravity, of something waiting that could no longer hurt him. When he finally slid it into the laptop, the screen flickered once, then glowed blue. The file name appeared. Video message, Macy. He hesitated for only a breath before pressing play. The image filled the screen, bright and fragile in the dark room. The screen flickered before settling into focus. For a moment there was only the hum of the old laptop fan and the faint hiss of static. And then she appeared. Macy sat in a chair by the cabin window, wrapped in the same wool blanket that now rested on Andrew's shoulders. Outside, snow drifted in soft waves past the glass. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, and thinner, but her eyes were bright, calm, and entirely present. She smiled when she looked into the camera, and the sound of her voice when she spoke was so sudden, so familiar, that it stole his breath. "If you're seeing this," she began softly, "then I guess I've already gone. I wish I could have told you these things in person, but we both know I would have stumbled through them, and you would have tried to make it easy for me, the way you always did. So I decided to record it here, in the place that felt most like the truth." She glanced toward the window where a branch tapped lightly against the glass. "This cabin, it saved me. Not from dying, but from the fear of dying. I came here when I was scared of what would happen to you, of what it would mean for you to be alone. I spent the first week just crying, trying to pretend I wasn't. And then one morning I woke up and saw the light coming through the frost, and I realized something. Life doesn't stop just because we do. The light keeps coming, the snow keeps falling, the fire still needs tending. That's what this place taught me. That's what I needed to leave for you." Her voice wavered slightly, but she steadied it with a smile. "You always thought I was stronger than you, but the truth is, you were the anchor. You made the world make sense for me. I wanted to return the favor somehow, to leave you something that could hold you when I no longer could. So I built this place up slowly with care. Every beam, every jar, every word I wrote was a way of saying, 'You're not alone. You never were.'" She paused, breathing carefully. He could see the effort it took for her to continue, but she did, steady and deliberate. "I know grief doesn't have rules. I know there'll be days when the silence feels like too much. But when it does, I want you to step outside. Just step into the cold. The world will remind you how alive it still is. Listen to the sound of the trees cracking, the snow shifting under your feet, the creek running under ice. Those are the sounds of now, and you belong to them. Don't shut them out." Andrew sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table, tears slipping silently down his face. She was there alive, vibrant, as if time had folded in on itself. "I also need to tell you something I couldn't before," she continued, her gaze softening. "It's about the baby. I know you found the note. I didn't hide it to deceive you. I just couldn't bear to make you live through another loss before it happened. It was early, barely a whisper of a heartbeat. But for those few days, I felt something extraordinary. I felt what it might have been like for us to start over again. Maybe that's why I built the cabin, to give us a piece of that life, even if it could never be. So when you stand here, when you breathe this air, you're standing in the life we might have had. And I hope that feels like love, not sadness." The image shimmered slightly, as if the recording had caught its breath along with her. She leaned closer, and her expression changed, tender, serious. "Promise me something, Andy. Promise me you won't stay locked in the past. This cabin isn't meant to trap you. It's meant to remind you, take what's here, take the peace, the quiet, and then go live again. Go back to the sea if you want, or stay here and build something new. But live. Don't keep yourself frozen in my memory. She gave a small laugh, the sound so perfectly hers that he had to close his eyes to steady himself. And maybe someday, you'll meet someone who makes you smile without guilt. I'd like that. I'd like to think love can keep happening, even after me. She looked away for a moment, toward the window where the snow still fell, and when she turned back, her eyes shone with tears. This will be my last winter here. I knew that when I came. But I'm not afraid. I want you to remember me like this. In the light, with the world still moving outside. Not in a hospital bed, not with pity or pain, but here, where everything feels real. Her hand reached forward, and for a moment it seemed as if she were about to touch him through the screen. You were my home, Andy, and now I hope this place can be yours. If you listen closely, you'll find me in every sound this cabin makes, in the wind, in the creak of the wood, in the crackle of the fire. You don't have to say goodbye, just keep the fire burning. She smiled then, tired but radiant. That's all. Thank you for my life, love. Thank you for every ordinary day. The screen went black. For a long while, Andrew didn't move. The cabin was utterly silent except for the whisper of the fire and the slow rhythm of his own breathing. He stared at the dark screen until his reflection came into view, lined, unshaven, but not hollow anymore. He reached out and traced the outline of her face on the glass, as though he could feel the warmth still lingering there. Then gently he closed the laptop. Outside, dawn had begun to touch the snow with color. Pale gold seeped between the trees, thin and hesitant at first, then bolder. He rose, wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was sharp, but he didn't flinch. He looked out over the valley, where the forest shimmered under the new light, each branch sparkling with ice. It was the first morning since her death that didn't feel heavy. He stood there for a long time, breathing deeply, letting the light sink into him. The sky widened above the peaks, shifting from silver to blue. Somewhere in the woods a bird called, its sound small but defiant against the silence. He smiled. When he went back inside, he stirred the fire, made fresh tea, and set 2 mugs on the table, out of habit, hers and his. It no longer hurt to see them side by side. The room felt fuller, as if the walls themselves carried her warmth. He took her notebook and added a final line beneath her last words. The fire's still burning. I'm still breathing. That afternoon, when the sun was high, he took a walk to the clearing where she carved the snowflake into the spruce. The wind had brushed away the old tracks, but he found the mark easily. The light struck the carved lines, filling them with brightness. He brushed the snow aside and whispered, "Thank you." Then he stood quietly, listening to the forest answer with its gentle symphony of creaks and sighs. On his way back, he noticed the way the snow glittered, each flake a brief spark of light before disappearing into the larger whiteness. He realized that this endless falling, this constant renewal was what she had meant. Life didn't stop. It simply changed its form. When evening came, the fire glowed bright and steady. He sat near it with the blanket around him, the last of her tea steaming beside his hand. Through the window, the stars began to appear one by one until the sky was full of them. The cabin felt alive, humming with the faint pulse of wood and wind. He thought of her voice, of the way she had said, "Keep the fire burning," and he understood now that it hadn't been a farewell. It was a direction, a way forward. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. The light flickered gently across the room, touching every surface she had once touched, and in that glow, he felt her presence, not as a ghost, but as warmth quiet, constant, and endlessly alive. The snow outside kept falling, and inside the fire kept burning, steady as breath. If this story moved you, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. There's more incredible stories waiting. Click the next video right here and share this one with someone who loves a good mystery.